My wife, Lynn, and I have been together for 6 years and married for 11 months. Our relationship has always been normal. No red flags, no strange behavior. Lynn is intelligent, kind, and thoughtful. She's always been serious, not the type for pranks or anything remotely creepy. She doesn't even like horror movies. When we first started dating, she barely made it halfway through The Shining before we had to turn it off. So what happened 2 months ago was completely out of character. One morning, while rushing to leave for work, I saw Lynn peeking at me from around the corner of the hallway. Her eyes and a strand of her long dark hair were visible, the rest of her hidden behind the wall. Startled, I nearly spilled my coffee. "Geez, Lynn, you scared the shit out of me," I said. She immediately ducked out of sight and scurried off toward the living room like a guilty child. By the time I left the house, she was laughing. It was strange, but I brushed it off as her being playful. She seemed perfectly normal later that day, so I didn't bring it up. 3 days later, I woke up at 2 a.m. for a drink. Standing at the kitchen island with a jug of orange juice in hand, I suddenly felt like I was being watched. When I glanced down, I saw her face peeking up at me from the other side of the island. Her wide, unblinking eyes stared, and she wore a grin so unnervingly large it reminded me of the Cheshire Cat. I screamed, out of pure fear, not irritation. At the sound, she scuttled backward on all fours, her hands and feet smacking the tile as she disappeared from view. I didn't follow her or even call out. I just stood there, frozen, wondering what had gotten into her. It took me longer than I'd like to admit to go back upstairs, but I eventually did. When I got to our bedroom, Lynn was lying on her side, asleep, or at least pretending to be. I stood there for a while, watching her breathing to make sure she was actually asleep. I expected her to jump out at me when I got into bed, but she didn't move. Her breathing was soft and steady, and I started to wonder if I'd imagined the whole thing. The next morning, over coffee, I decided to ask her about it. "What was that about last night?" I asked casually, not wanting to offend her. She frowned, confused, and shook her head. "What are you talking about?" "You were peeking at me again," I said, pointing to the spot by the kitchen island. She followed my gaze, then burst into laughter. She laughed so hard that I couldn't help but join in. "You creep me out sometimes, you know that?" I said, grinning. "You creep me out all the time, so I guess we're even," she teased, wrapping her arms around my neck. We said our goodbyes and went to work, but the image of her grinning at me from behind the island stayed with me. It wasn't fear, exactly, but something about it didn't sit right. Over the next few weeks, I started seeing her peeking at me more and more, from behind the couch, the curtains, and even from inside her grandmother's old trunk at the foot of our bed. The lid was propped open just enough for half of her face to peek through, her grin unnervingly childlike. "Why are you doing this?" I finally asked one day, but she didn't answer. Instead, she slowly closed the lid, shutting herself inside the trunk. I walked away, disturbed but hoping she'd tire of the game soon. 2 weeks passed without any incidents. Relieved, I joked one evening while watching Netflix, "I guess you've given up on your little spy game, huh?" She looked at me with a sly smile. "Maybe I've just gotten better at it." That comment stuck with me. For days, I felt paranoid, constantly checking corners and doors. I hated how jumpy I'd become, but after a few weeks without another incident, I managed to convince myself it was all in the past. Then, a few nights ago, things got much worse. Lynn went to a friend's house, leaving me alone. Around 9 p.m., I hopped in the shower. As I rinsed the soap from my hair, I felt that awful sensation of being watched. Slowly, I opened my eyes and almost had a heart attack. Lynn was peeking from behind the shower curtain, her head fully inside the shower while her body stayed outside. Her long, dark hair dripped against the curtain and her wide, unblinking eyes were bloodshot. Her mouth hung open in a terrible grin, her makeup streaking down her cheeks in black lines. She looked giddy and completely deranged. I screamed and jumped back against the wall, but she didn't move. Her grin never wavered. For a few moments, we just stood there, frozen. Finally, she slowly pulled her head out of the shower, and I watched her blurry figure retreat toward the bathroom door. A second later, the door slammed shut so hard it rattled the mirror. Terrified, I locked the door and stayed inside the bathroom for over an hour, pacing and listening for any sound outside. I told myself I was done putting up with her crazy behavior, joke or not. My anger built as I yelled through the door, "What the fuck, Lynn? This shit is getting really annoying." There was no response, just a faint moan followed by silence. My frustration turned to fear. "Lynn?" I called, my voice shaky. Still nothing. I was too scared to face her, but couldn't stay locked in the bathroom forever. After 30 agonizing minutes, I crouched down and peered under the door. I expected to see her face, but the hallway was empty. I stood up, hand trembling as I unlocked the door. Just as I was about to open it, a louder moan echoed through the room. Slowly, I turned my head toward the closet door. Through the small gap, I saw her wide eyes locked on mine, her grotesque, gaping smile stretching impossibly large. Her hands were clasped against her chest, trembling as if she could barely contain her excitement. A short, raspy moan bubbled from her throat, deep and raw. I didn't scream. I was too terrified to make a sound. Somehow, I managed to yank the bathroom door open and sprinted down the steps, grabbing my keys and phone before bolting outside to my car. Lynn's shrill laughter echoed behind me, but she didn't follow. I didn't even shut the front door. I sped away, shivering in my damp boxers, too scared and cold to care. I drove straight to my brother Chris's house, ignoring every call and text. Once parked in his driveway, I checked my phone. Lynn had called 4 times and sent a flood of texts, all asking why I'd left like that. Furious at her casual attitude, I threw my phone at the dash. Chris and his wife were shocked to see me in such a state, but they let me stay. I told Chris we'd had a fight, but left out the details, not wanting him to think I was overreacting. After all, hadn't I always encouraged Lynn to loosen up? This wasn't what I had in mind. I tried to sleep on their sofa, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw Lynn's face peering at me from the closet. Knowing she'd been there the whole time made my skin crawl. Chris eventually gave me a sleeping pill, but even then, my dreams were filled with her smiling face. I woke at sunrise, sore and drained. I wanted to call her, to tell her I wasn't coming back until she promised to stop the creepy behavior. I just wanted my normal wife back. As I lay there, trying to figure out what to say, that familiar sensation returned. I was being watched. My heart pounded as I stared at the ceiling, trying to ignore it, but the feeling only grew worse. Slowly, my eyes drifted to the window. Her face was pressed against the glass, her wide, gaping smile smeared with drool that streaked down the pane. She'd been there for a while, maybe all night. Anger overtook my fear. I leaped up and pounded on the window. "Lynn, are you crazy? What the hell is wrong with you? Go home." She didn't move. Her expression stayed frozen, but her smile grew even wider. I heard Chris and his wife stirring upstairs, and as if sensing them, Lynn's head twitched slightly in their direction. Slowly, her mouth began to close. Chris called my name from upstairs, concerned. I turned to see him and Rebecca rushing down the steps. When I looked back at the window, Lynn was gone. The only trace of her was the streaks of drool dripping down the glass. "Do you think this fight can be mended?" she asked. "I don't know. She's like a different person," I admitted, still hesitant to share the full extent of what had happened. "People change, Ben. She's still the woman you married. Maybe you just need to talk through your issues," Rebecca offered. "It's beyond that. I don't think talking will help. I just don't trust her," I said, the words stinging as I spoke them. Rebecca frowned. "Lynn loves you. She must be devastated." "I don't know about that," I muttered. "She seemed like it to me." "I've never seen her so upset," Rebecca said. Her words sank in slowly and dread crept over me. "Wait, what do you mean? Did you see her?" Rebecca nodded casually as if it wasn't horrifying. "She stopped by this morning after Chris left for work. I didn't see her car though. Maybe she took an Uber." I felt sweat bead on my forehead. "Becca, what did she say? Did she come inside?" "She just asked if you were awake and said to let you sleep," Rebecca replied as she washed the dishes. "That's all?" "She didn't say anything else?" I pressed. Rebecca shook her head. "No, but she looked awful like she hadn't slept in days. You should call her." I thanked Rebecca for lunch and tried to reassure myself. At least Lynn hadn't come inside. Still, I double-checked the locks, unable to shake the unease. I sat, debating my next move. I didn't want to go home, but I felt an obligation to help her. Hadn't I vowed to love her in sickness and in health? Clearly, she was sick, and I needed to get her help. But where to start? The police would likely dismiss me. What was I supposed to say? That my wife was peeking at me? As bizarre as her behavior was, it wasn't criminal. It felt wrong, though. Dangerous. There was something deeply sinister beneath her smile. I knew I had the legal right to have her committed, but what if she fooled the doctors the way she had Rebecca? Without evidence she was a danger, they'd release her within 72 hours. I felt lost, so reluctantly I did the one thing I never wanted to do. I called her mother. Marianne and I weren't on bad terms, but we weren't close either. She was cold, distant, and hard to talk to. Her rare smiles were thin-lipped and empty, her eyes devoid of warmth. Both times we'd met, Lynn ushered me out quickly to spare me the discomfort. Still, I needed help, and she was the only person who knew Lynn better than I did. "Yes?" she answered, already sounding irritated. "Marianne, it's Ben. Do you have a minute?" I asked hesitantly. She sighed audibly. "I'm in the middle of writing checks, but if you insist, I suppose I can spare a moment." "What do you want to discuss, Benjamin?" "It's about Lynn," I began. "She's been acting strangely. I was wondering if you'd noticed anything. Any odd behavior or possible mental health issues?" There was a long pause. Finally, she spoke, her tone cool and dismissive. "I'm not sure if this is one of your jokes, Benjamin, but if so, I don't find it funny. Now, as I said, I have a business to attend to." "Marianne, please," I interrupted, desperate to keep her on the line. "Marianne, it's not a joke. I'm seriously concerned about Lynn. Her behavior has been erratic, and I'm worried. As her mother, I thought you'd want to help," I said, frustration clear in my voice. "If you're truly concerned, then get health professionals involved. I don't know what you expect from me," she snapped. I could feel she was about to hang up, and desperation clawed at me. "Please, if not for me, do it for Lynn," I pleaded. I heard her take a shaky breath, her composure faltering. "Marianne, what's wrong?" I started, but she cut me off. "Benjamin, I don't know what to tell you. My only advice is to seek professional help. Do not call here again. Goodbye." Before I could respond, she hung up. I sat there stunned, replaying the conversation. Why wouldn't she want to help her own daughter? Her words kept circling in my mind, especially the way she said to seek professional help. There was an urgency, a subtle shift in her tone. Was she referring to doctors or someone else? When Chris got home, I told him and Rebecca about my last encounter with Lynn, how she hid in the bathroom, peeking from the closet. They were shocked, but believed me. They both agreed Lynn needed help, though they didn't think it was as serious as I did. Rebecca even suggested it might be some kind of elaborate YouTube prank. Chris suggested we try talking to her calmly and reasoning with her. I agreed, grateful I wouldn't have to go back to the house alone. This morning, just after breakfast, we drove to the house. There was no way I was going at night. As we pulled into the driveway, my stomach churned. Her car wasn't there, but I wasn't about to let my guard down. The front door was ajar. For a split second, I imagined her eyes peeking through the gap. My hands shook as I pushed the door open, Chris following behind me like this was all some casual outing. The stench hit us immediately, a sickening odor of rot. Chris wrinkled his nose. "What do you clean your floors with? Shit?" he muttered. "Shut up," I hissed, my eyes scanning the dark interior. Despite it being morning, the house was pitch black. The curtains were drawn tight, blocking out any light. If I hadn't left just 2 days ago, I'd think the place was abandoned. We moved through each room cautiously, checking every possible hiding spot. "Lynn?" I called out, my voice trembling. Silence was our only answer. "Who the fuck lines up eyeballs in their closet?" Chris mumbled. "I told you she needed help," I said. "Help? She needs a fucking exorcist," he replied. "Let's go. I can't stand the smell any." Chris stopped mid-sentence, his eyes wide with fear. I didn't need to ask why. I felt it too. Someone was watching us. I turned slowly, my eyes scanning the room. "Christ," I whispered. Under the bed, curled on her side like an eager child on Christmas morning, was Lynn. Her hands were clasped under her chin, trembling with excitement. Now that she knew she'd been found, I could hear her making quiet, hiccuping noises as if she couldn't contain herself. Her wide, unblinking eyes and grotesque grin were unnerving, to say the least. Every instinct told me to run, but I forced myself to stay. This was my wife. Twisted, yes, but still my wife. "Lynn," I said softly. She didn't speak, but her head bobbed in 2 quick, jerky nods. "Baby, I just want to help, okay?" Can you let me do that? I asked, taking a cautious step forward. I love you, Lynn, I said gently, inching closer. A soft moan escaped her open mouth. Her shoulders quivered, and her wide eyes seemed to grow even larger. I crouched down to get a better look and immediately noticed the blood. Her hands were covered in it, trembling as though she could barely contain herself. Lynn, are you hurt? You're bleeding, I said. She nodded quickly, her bloody fingers twitching like they were playing an invisible piano, occasionally grazing her chin and smearing blood on her skin. The stench was overwhelming, and I fought back the urge to vomit. Her lips were cracked and stretched thin, with blood seeping between them. I knew she wouldn't come out willingly, but I couldn't leave her like this. I scooted closer and reached out to her. The hiccuping sounds grew louder, her hands shaking harder. That's when I noticed the blood oozing from between her fingers. Oh my God, Lynn, you're bleeding, I said, instinctively reaching for her hand. Before I could touch her, she lunged, a sharp pain shooting through my arm. I fell back, clutching my arm as blood dripped onto the carpet. I looked up in shock and saw her grinning wildly, holding a shard of glass. You all right in there? Chris called from behind me. I turned slightly and nodded, cradling my injured arm. When I looked back at Lynn, her focus had shifted. She wasn't smiling anymore. Her eyes were locked on Chris, her expression twisted into a snarl. I got to my feet and backed down the hall. Chris, run, I whispered. Chris hesitated, still staring as Lynn crawled out from under the bed, gripping the glass shard. Jesus, Lynn, Chris stammered. You, playing hide and seek? Move, Chris, I hissed, pushing him toward the stairs. Lynn began bobbing her head sharply, grinning as her mouth stretched impossibly wide. Chris muttered a prayer and bolted down the stairs. I stood frozen, torn between my love for her and the overwhelming instinct to survive. I only want to help, I choked out, tears blurring my vision. Her eyes locked back onto me as she lifted the glass and sprinted forward with terrifying excitement. My body reacted before my brain could, and I flew down the stairs, skipping 2 or 3 at a time. I reached the front door just as I felt her leap onto my back. Her arms wrapped around my neck, and her hiccuping noises were painfully close to my ear. Panicked, I threw her off me, sending her to the floor. A sharp pain seared across my back, but I didn't stop. I ripped open the door and bolted outside. Chris was in the yard, already on the phone with the police. I didn't stop to explain. I jumped into my car. Chris quickly followed, still talking to 911. I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, expecting to see her running after us, but she never appeared. I went straight to the ER, where I received 11 stitches in my arm and 3 on my back. The police asked a lot of questions and went back to search the house, but Lynn wasn't there. They advised me to stay with someone I trusted and to file a restraining order, but I knew it wouldn't matter. Somehow, I just knew. After dropping Chris off, I drove to a motel an hour away. I needed as much distance as possible between me and Lynn. I've been here for the last 4 hours, hoping the police would find her and get her the help she desperately needs. But now I'm not so sure. 40 minutes ago, I got a text from an unknown number, 3 simple words. I found you. Attached was a picture, dark and grainy, but unmistakable. It was Lynn's eye. I don't know what to do. I'm alone and scared, and I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched.